Hello, my name is Midnight Dave. Thank you for joining us for Scary Stories to Tell on Sundays, a weekly series part of Hallo'Boogie, a virtual month-long Halloween celebration brought to you by the Midnite Romero Society. Each week we will be presenting a collection of short stories split into two categories, family-friendly and mature, and read them to you in celebration of the wonderful month of October. So without further ado, today I'll be reading October in the Chair by Neil Gaiman. October was in the chair. So it was chilly that evening, and the leaves were red and orange and tumbled from the trees that circled the grove. The 12 of them sat around a campfire roasting huge sausages on sticks, which spat and crackled as the fat dripped onto the burning apple wood, and drinking fresh apple cider, tangy and tart in their mouths. April took a dainty bite from her sausage, which burst open as she bit into it, spilling hot juice all over her chin. "Be shrew and suck o' jur on it," she said. Spat March, sitting next to her, laughed, low and dirty, and then pulled out a huge, filthy handkerchief. "Here you go," he said. April wiped her chin. "Thanks," she said. "The cursed bag of innards burned me. I'll have a blister there tomorrow." September yawned. "You are such a hypochondriac," he said, across the fire. "And such language!" He had a pencil-thin mustache, and was balding in the front, which made his forehead seem high and wise. "Lay off her," said May. Her dark hair was cropped short against her skull, and she wore sensible boots. She smoked a small brown cigarillo that smelled heavy of cloves. "She's sensitive." "Oh, please," said September. "Spare me." October, conscious of his position in the chair, sipped his cider, cleared his throat, and said, "Okay, who wants to begin?" The chair he sat in was carved from one large block of oak wood, inlay with ash, with cedar, and with cherry wood. The other 11 sat on tree stumps equally spaced about the small bonfire. The tree stumps had been worn smooth, comfortable by years of use. "What about the minutes?" asked January. "We always do minutes when I'm in the chair." "But you aren't in the chair now, are you, dear?" said September, an elegant creature of mock solitude. "What about the minutes?" repeated January. "You can't ignore them." "Let the little beggars take care of themselves," said April, one hand running through her long blonde hair. "And I think September should go first." September preened and nodded. "Delighted," he said. "Hey," said February. Hey, I didn't hear the chairman ratify that. Nobody starts until October says who starts, and then nobody else talks. We can have maybe the tiniest semblance of order here?" He peered at them, small, pale, dressed entirely in blue and grays. "It's fine," said October. His beard was all colors, a grove of trees in autumn, deep brown and fire orange and wine red, an untrimmed tangle across the lower half of his face. His cheeks were apple red. He looked like a friend, like someone you had known all your life. "September can go first. Let's just get this thing rolling." September placed the end of his sausage into his mouth, chewed it daintily, and drained his cider mug. Then he stood up and bowed to the company and began to speak. Laurette Delisle was the finest chef in all Seattle. At least, Laurette Delisle thought so, and the Michelin stars on his door confirmed him in his opinion. He was a remarkable chef, it is true. His minced lamb brioche had won several awards. His smoked quail and white truffle ravioli had been described in the Gastronome as the 10th wonder of the world. But it was his wine cellar, his wine cellar, that was the point of his pride and his passion. "I understand that. The last of the white grapes are harvested in me, and the bulk of the reds. I appreciate fine wines, the aroma, the taste, the aftertaste as well." Laurette Delisle bought his wines at auctions, from private wine lovers, from reputable dealers. He would insist on a pedigree for each wine, for wine frauds are, alas, too common, when the bottle is selling for perhaps $5, $10, $100,000, or pounds, or euros. The treasure, the jewel, the rarest of the rare and the non plus ultra of his temperature-controlled wine cellar was a bottle of 1902 Chateau Lafite. It was on the wine list at $120,000, although it was, in true terms, priceless, for it was the last bottle of its kind. "Excuse me," said August, politely. He was the fattest of them all, his thin hair combed in golden wisps across his pink pate. September glared down at his neighbor. "Yes?" "Is this the one where some rich dude buys the wine to go with the dinner, and the chef decides that the dinner the rich dude ordered isn't good enough for the wine, so he sends out a different dinner, and the guy takes one mouthful, and he's got like some rare allergy and just dies like that, and the wine never gets drunk after all?" September said nothing. He looked a great deal. "Because if it is, you told it before, years ago. Dumb story then, dumb story now." August smiled, his pink cheeks sewed in the firelight. September said, "Well, pathos and culture are not everyone's taste. Some people prefer their barbecues and beer. Some of us like..." February interrupted. "Well, I hate to say this, but he kinda does have a point. It has to be a new story." September raised an eyebrow and pursed his lips. "I'm done," he said abruptly, and sat down on his stump. They looked at one another across the fire. The months of the year. June, hesitant and clean, raised her hand and said, "I have one about a guard on the X-ray machine at LaGuardia Airport who could read all about people from the outlines of their luggage on the screen. And one day she saw a luggage X-ray so beautiful that she fell in love with the person, and she had to figure out which person in line it was, and she couldn't, and she pined for months and months, and then the person came through again, and she knew it this time, and it was a man, and he was a wizened old Indian man, and she was pretty and black and like 25, and she knew it would never work out, and she let him go because she also sees the shapes of his bags on the screen, and he was going to die soon." October said, "Fair enough, young June. Tell that one." June stared at him like a spooked animal. I just did," she said. October nodded. "So you did," he said, before any of the others could say anything. And then he said, "Shall we proceed with my story, then?" February sniffed. "Out of order there, big fella. The man in the chair only tells his story when the rest of us are through. Can't go straight to the main event." May was placing a dozen chestnuts on the grate above the fire, deploying them into patterns with her tongs. "Let him tell his story if he wants to," she said. "God knows it can't be worse than that one about the wine. I have had things to be getting back to. Flowers don't bloom by themselves. All in favor?" "You're taking this to a formal vote?" February said. "I cannot believe this. I can't believe this is happening." He mopped his brow with a handful of tissues, which he pulled from his sleeve. 7 hands were raised. 4 people kept their hands down. February, September, January, and July. "I don't have anything personal on this," said July, apologetically. "This is purely procedural. We shouldn't be setting precedents." "It's settled then," said October. "Is there anything anyone would like to say before I begin?" Yes, sometimes," said June. "Sometimes I think someone's watching us from the woods, and then I look, and there isn't anyone there. But I still think it." April said, "That's because you're crazy." Said September to everybody. "That's our April. She's sensitive, but she's still the cruelest." "Enough," said October. He stretched in his chair, he cracked a comb nut in his teeth, pulled out the kernel, and threw the fragments of shell into the fire, where they hissed and spat and popped, and he began. "There was a boy," October said, "who was miserable at home, although they did not beat him. He did not fit well, not his family, his town, or even his life. He had 2 older brothers, who were twins, older than he was, and who hurt him or ignored him, and were popular. They played football. Some games one twin would score more and be the hero, and some games the other would. Their little brother did not play football. They had a name for their brother. They called him the Runt. They had called him the Runt since he was a baby, and at first their mother and father chided them for it. The twins said, "But he is the runt of the litter. Look at him. Look at us." The boys were 6 when they said this. Their parents thought it was cute. A name like the Runt can be infectious, so pretty soon the only person who called him Donald was his grandmother, when she telephoned him on his birthday, and people who did not know him. Now, perhaps because names have power, he was a runt, skinny and small and nervous. He had been born with a runny nose, and it had not stopped running in a decade. At mealtimes, if the twins liked the food, they would steal his. If they did not, they would contrive to place their food on his plate, and he would find himself in trouble for leaving good food uneaten. Their father never missed a football game, and would buy an ice cream afterward for the twin who had scored the most, and a consolation ice cream for the other twin who hadn't. Their mother described herself as a newspaper woman, although she mostly sold advertising space and subscriptions. She had gone back to work full-time once the twins were capable of taking care of themselves. The other kids in the boys' class admired the twins. They had called him Donald for several weeks in first grade, until the word trickled down that his brothers called him the Runt. His teachers rarely called him anything at all, although among themselves they could sometimes be heard to say that it was a pity the youngest Cavoy boy didn't have the pluck or the imagination or the life of his brothers. The Runt could not have told you when he first decided to run away, nor when his daydreams crossed the border and became plans. By the time that he admitted to himself he was leaving, he had a large Tupperware container hidden beneath a plastic sheet behind the garage containing 3 Mars bars, 2 Milky Ways, a bag of nuts, a small bag of licorice, a flashlight, several comics, an unopened packet of beef jerky, and $37, most of it in quarters. He did not like the taste of beef jerky, but he had read that explorers had survived for weeks on nothing else. And it was when he put the packet of beef jerky into the Tupperware box and pressed the lid down with a pop that he knew he was going to have to run away. He had read books, newspapers, and magazines. He knew that if you ran away, you sometimes met bad people who did bad things to you. But he had also read fairy tales. So he knew that there were kind people out there, side by side with the monsters. The Runt was a thin 10-year-old, small, with a runny nose and a blank expression. If you were to try to pick him out of a group of boys, you'd be wrong. He'd be the other one, over at the side, the one your eye slipped over. All through September he put off leaving. It took a really bad Friday, during the course of which both his brothers sat on him, and the one who sat on his face broke wind and laughed uproariously. For him to decide that whatever monsters were waiting out in the world would be bearable, perhaps even preferable. Saturday, his brothers were meant to be looking after him, but soon they went into town to see a girl they liked. The Runt went around the back of the garage and took the Tupperware container out from beneath the plastic sheeting. He took it up to his bedroom, emptied his school bag onto his bed, filled it with his candies, his comics, and quarters, and the beef jerky. He filled an empty soda bottle with water. The Runt walked into town and got on the bus. He rode west, $10 and quarters worth of west, to a place he didn't know, which he thought was a good place to start, and then he got off the bus and walked. There was no sidewalk now, so when cars came past he would edge over into the ditch, to safety. The sun was high. He was hungry, so he rummaged into his bag and pulled out a Mars bar. After he ate it, he found he was thirsty, and he drank almost half the water from his soda bottle before he realized he was going to have to ration it. He had thought that once he got out of town, he would see springs of fresh water everywhere, but there were none to be found. There was a river, though, that ran beneath a wide bridge. The runt stopped halfway across the bridge to stare down at the brown water. He remembered something he had been told in school, that in the end all rivers flowed into the sea. He had never been to the seashore. He clambered down the bank and followed the river. There was a muddy path along the sidewalk of the riverbank, and an occasional beer can or plastic snack packet to show that people have been that way before. But he saw no one as he walked. He finished his water. He wondered if they were looking for him yet. He imagined police cars and helicopters and dogs, all trying to look for him. He would evade them. He would make it to the sea. The river ran over some rocks, and it splashed. He saw a blue heron, its wings wide, glide past him, and he saw solitary end-of-season dragonflies, and sometimes a small cluster of midges enjoying the Indian summer. The blue sky became dusk gray, and a bat swung down to snatch insects from the air. The runt wondered where he would sleep that night. Soon the path divided, and he took the branch that led away from the river, hoping it would lead to a house or to a farm with an empty barn. He walked for some time as the dusk deepened, until at the end of the path he found a farmhouse, half tumbled down and unpleasant looking. The runt walked around it, becoming increasingly certain as he walked that nothing could make him go inside, and then he climbed over a broken fence to an abandoned pasture and settled down to sleep in the long grass with his school bag for his pillow. He lay on his back, fully dressed, staring up at the sky. He was not in the slightest bit sleepy. "They'll be missing me by now," he told himself. "They'll be worried." He imagined himself coming home in a few years' time, the delight on his family's faces as he walked up to the path to home, their welcome, their love. He woke some hours later with the bright moonlight in his face. He could see the whole world, as bright as day, like in the nursery rhyme, but pale and without colors. Above him the moon was full, or almost, and he imagined a face looking down at him, not unkindly, in the shadows and shapes of the moon's face. A voice said, "Where do you come from?" He sat up, not scared, not yet, and looked around. Trees, long grass. "Where are you? I don't see you." Something he had taken for a shadow moved beside a tree on the edge of the pasture, and he saw a boy of his own age. "I'm running away from home," said the runt. "Whoa," said the boy. "That must have taken a whole lot of guts." The runt grinned with pride, but he didn't know what to say. "You want to walk a bit?" said the boy. "Sure," said the runt. He moved his school bag so it was next to the fence post, so he could always find it again. They walked down the slope, giving a wide berth to the old farmhouse. "Does anyone live there?" asked the runt. "Not really," said the other boy. He had a fair, fine hair that was almost white in the moonlight. "Some people tried a long time back, but they didn't like it, and they left. Then other folk moved in, but no one lives there now. What's your name?" "Donald," said the runt, and then, "But they call me the runt. What do they call you?" The boy hesitated. "Dearly," he said. "That's a cool name." Dearly said, "I used to have another name, but I can't read it anymore." They squeezed through a huge iron gateway, rusted part open, part closed, and they were in a little meadow at the bottom of the slope. "This place is cool," said the runt. There were dozens of stones of all sizes in the small meadow. Tall stones, bigger than either of the boys, small stones, just the right size for sitting on. There were some broken stones, The runt knew what sort of place this was, but it did not scare him. It was a loved place. "Who's buried here?" he asked. "Mostly okay people," said Dearly. "There used to be a town over there, past those trees. Then the railway came, and they built a stop in the town next over. So our town sort of dried up and fell in and blew away. There's brushes and trees now, where the town was. You can hide in the trees and go into the old houses and jump out." The runt said, "Are they like that farmhouse up there, the houses?" He didn't want to go in them if they were. "No," said Dearly. "No one goes in them, except for me. And some animals sometimes. I'm the only kid around here." "I figured," said the runt. "Maybe we can go down and play in them," said Dearly. "That would be pretty cool," said the runt. It was a perfect early October night, almost as warm as summer, and the harvest moon dominated the sky. You could see everything. "Which one of these is yours?" asked the runt. Dearly straightened up proudly and took the runt by the hand. He pulled him to an overgrown corner of the field. The two boys pushed aside the long grass. The stone was set flat into the ground, and it had dates carved into it from 100 years before. Much of it was worn away, but beneath the dates it was possible to make out the words, "Dearly departed, will never be forg." "Forgotten, I'd wager," said Dearly. "Yeah, that's what I was about to say too," said the runt. They went out of the gate, down a gully, and into what remained of the old town. Trees grew through houses, and buildings had fallen in on themselves, but it wasn't scary. They played hide and seek. They explored. Dearly showed the runt some pretty cool places, including a one-room cottage that he said was the oldest building in that whole part of the county. It was in pretty good shape, too, considering how old it was. "I can see pretty good by moonlight," said the runt. "Even inside. I didn't know that was so easy to do." "Yeah," said Dearly, "and after a while you get good at seeing even when there ain't any moonlight." The runt was envious. "I got to go to the bathroom," said the runt. "Is there somewhere around here?" Dearly thought for a moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't do that stuff anymore. There are a few outhouses still standing, but they may not be safe. Best just do it in the woods." "Like a bear," said the runt. They walked out the back into the woods that pushed up against the wall of the cottage, and went behind a tree. He'd never done that before, in the open air. He felt like a wild animal. When he was done, he wiped himself off with fallen leaves. Then he went back out to the front. Dearly was sitting in a pool of moonlight, waiting for him. "How did you die?" asked the runt. "I got sick," said Dearly. "My ma cried and carried on something fierce. Then I died." "If I stay here with you," said the runt, "would I have to be dead too?" "Maybe," said Dearly. "Well, yeah, I guess. What's it like, being dead?" "I don't mind it," said Dearly. "Worst thing is not having anyone to play with." "But there must be lots of people up in that meadow," said Runt. "Don't you ever play with them?" "Nope," said Dearly. "Mostly they sleep. And when they walk, they can't be bothered to just go and see stuff and do things. They can't be bothered with me. You see that tree?" It was a birch tree, its smooth gray bark cracked with age. It sat in what must once have been the town square, 90 years before. "Yeah," said Runt. "You want to climb it?" "It looks kinda high." "It is, real high. But it's easy to climb. I'll show you." It was easy to climb. There were handholds in the bark, and the boys went up the big birch like a couple of monkeys or pirates or warriors. From the top of the tree one could see the whole world. The sky was starting to lighten just a hair in the east. Everything waited. The night was ending. The world was holding its breath, preparing to begin again. "This was the best day I ever had," said the runt. "Me too," said Dearly. "What you going to do now?" "I don't know," said the runt. He imagined himself going on across the world, all the way to the sea. He imagined himself growing up and growing older, bringing himself up by his bootstraps. Somewhere in there he would become absolutely wealthy, and then he would go back to the house with the twins in it, and he would drive up to their door in his wonderful car, or perhaps he would turn up at a football game. In his imagination, the twins had neither aged nor grown, and look down at them in a kindly way. He would buy them all, the twins, his parents, a meal at the finest restaurant in the city, and they would tell him how badly they misunderstood him and mistreated him. They apologized and wept, and through it all he said nothing. He let their apologies wash over him, and then he would give each of them a gift, and afterwards he would leave their lives once more, this time for good. It was a fine dream. In reality, he knew he would keep walking, and be found tomorrow or the day after that, and go home and be yelled at, and everything would be the same as it ever was. And day after day, hour after hour, until the end of time, he'd still be the runt, only they'd be mad at him for having dared to walk away. "I have to go to bed soon," said Dearly. He started to climb down the big birch tree. Climbing down the tree was harder, the runt found. He couldn't see where you were putting your feet and had to feel around somewhere to put them. Sometimes he slipped and slid, but Dearly went down ahead of him and would say things like, "A little to the right now," and they both made it down just fine. The sky continued to lighten, and the moon was fading, and it was harder to see. They clambered back through the gully. Sometimes the runt wasn't sure that Dearly was there at all, but when he got to the top, he saw the boy waiting for him. They didn't say much as they walked up to the meadow filled with stones. The runt put his arm over Dearly's shoulder, and they walked in step up the hill. "Well," said Dearly, "thanks for coming over." "I had a good time," said the runt. "Yeah," said Dearly, "me too." Down in the woods somewhere a bird began to sing. "If I wanted to stay," said the runt, all in a burst. Then he stopped. I might never get another chance to change it, thought the runt. He'd never get to the sea. They'd never let him. Dearly didn't say anything, not for long. The world was gray. More birds joined the first. "I can't do it," said Dearly eventually. "But they might." "Who?" "The ones in there." The fairy boy pointed up the slope to the tumbled-down farmhouse with the jagged, broken windows, silhouetted against the dawn. The gray light had not changed it. The runt shivered. "There's people in there?" he said. "I thought you said it was empty." "It ain't empty," said Dearly. "I said nobody lives there. Different things." He looked up at the sky. "I gotta go now," he added. He squeezed Runt's hand, and then he just wasn't there any longer. The runt stood in the little graveyard all on his own, listening to the bird song on the morning air. Then he made his way up the hill. It was harder by himself. He picked up his school bag from the place he had left it. He ate his last Milky Way and stared at the tumbled-down building. The empty windows of the farmhouse were like eyes watching him. It was darker inside there, darker than anything. He pushed his way through the weed-choked yard. The door to the farmhouse was mostly crumbled away. He stopped at the doorway, hesitating, wondering if it was wise to do this. He could smell damp and rot and something else underneath. He thought he heard something move, deep in the house, in the cellar maybe, or the attic. A shuffle maybe, or a hop. It was hard to tell. Eventually, he went inside. Nobody said anything. October filled his wooden mug with apple cider when he was done, and drained it, and filled it again. "It was a story," said December. "I'll say that for it." He rubbed his pale blue eyes with a fist. The fire was almost out. "What happened next?" asked June nervously. "After you went into the house?" May, sitting next to her, put her hand on June's arm. "Better not think about it," she said. "Anyone else want a turn?" asked August. There was silence. "Then I think we're done." "That needs to be an official motion," pointed out February. "All in favor?" said October. There was a chorus of ayes. All against? Silence. "Then I declare this meeting adjourned." They got up from the fire, stretching and yawning, and walked away into the wood, in ones and twos and threes, until only October and his neighbor remained. "Your turn in the chair next time," said October. "I know," said November. He was pale and thin-lipped. He helped October out of the wooden chair. "I like your stories. Mine are always too dark." "I don't think so," said October. "It's just that your nights are longer, and you aren't as warm." "Put it like that," said November, "and I feel better. I suppose we can't help who we are." "That's the spirit," said his brother, and they touched hands as they walked away from the fire's orange embers, taking their stories with them back into the dark.
The Spider and the Flea by the Brothers Grimm, read by Jenny from the Grave. A spider and a flea dwelt together in one house, and brewed their beer in an eggshell. One day, when the spider was stirring it up, she fell in and scalded herself. Thereupon the flea began to scream, and then the door asked, "Why are you screaming, Flea?" "Because the little spider has scalded herself in the beer tub," replied she. Thereupon the door began to creak, as if it were in pain. And a broom, which stood in the corner, asked, "Why are you creaking for, door?" "May I not creak?" it replied. "For the little spider scalded herself, and the flea weeps." So the broom began to sweep industriously, and presently a little cart came by, and asked the reason. "May I not sweep?" replied the broom. "The little spider scalded herself, and the flea weeps. The little door creaks with pain." Thereupon the little cart said, "So I will run," and began to run very fast past a heap of ashes, which cried out, "Why do you run, little cart?" "Because," replied the cart, "the little spider scalded herself, and the flea weeps. The little door creaks with the pain, and the broom sweeps." Then the ashes said, "I will burn furiously." Now, next the ashes there grew a tree, which asked, "Little heap, why do you burn?" "Because," was the reply, "the little spider scalded herself, and the flea weeps. The little door creaks with the pain, and the broom sweeps. The little cart runs on so fast." Therefore the tree cried, "I will shake myself," and went on shaking till all the leaves fell off. A little girl passing by with a water pitcher saw it shaking, and asked, "Why do you shake yourself, little tree?" "Why may I not?" said the tree. "The little spider scalded herself, and the flea weeps. The little door creaks with the pain, and the broom sweeps. The little cart runs on so fast, and the ashes burn." Then the maiden said, "If so, I will break my pitcher," and she threw it down and broke it. At this, the streamlet, from which she drew the water, asked, "Why do you break your pitcher, my little girl? "Why may I not?" she replied. "For the little spider scalded herself, and the flea sweeps. The little spider scalded herself, and the flea weeps. The little door cracks with the pain, and the broom sweeps. The little cart runs on so fast, and the ashes burn. The little tree shakes down its leaves. Now it's my turn." "Ah, then," said the streamlet, "now must I begin to flow." And it flowed and flowed along in great stream, which kept getting bigger and bigger until it swallowed up the little girl and the little tree, the ashes, the cart, the broom, the door, the flea, and last of all the spider, all together. The end.
Hello everyone, Midnight Dave here again. Just letting you know that this concludes our family-friendly segment, and up next is our mature segment, so listener discretion is advised. Thank you, and hope you enjoy.
Hello, this is Michael Welch, and I am celebrating Hallo'Boogie with the Midnite Romero Society, and as part of Scary Stories to Read on Sundays, I am going to read a Jack Ketchum short story. It is from his collection Peaceable Kingdom, and it's entitled The Rifle. She found the rifle standing on its stock in the back of his cluttered closet, unexpected as a snake in there. Not that he'd made very much attempt to hide it. It was leaning in the corner behind the 20-pound fiberglass bow and the quiver of target arrows his father had bought him for Christmas, over her objections. His winter jacket hung in front of it. She'd moved the jacket aside, and there it was. He'd complained in the past about her going in his closet. For a long time she'd obliged him. Privacy, she knew, was important to a 10-year-old. It was especially important to Danny. But when you noticed dust balls rolling out from under the door, somebody was going to have to get it in there and clean, and obviously it wasn't going to be him. She was only planning to vacuum. Now this. She reached around behind her and turned off the Electrolux. For a moment she just knelt there, staring at the rifle in the heavy summer silence. A slim black barrel lurking in the shadows. A secret, she thought. Yet another. She reached inside and grasped the cool metal, drew it out into the light. The rifle was an old bolt-action .22. Her brother had owned one very much like it when he was 15. Took it down to the VFW target range on Saturdays for a while. Then he discovered girls. Danny was only 10. Where in God's name had he got it? Richard wouldn't have bought it for him. Not even her ex-husband was fool enough to think for 1 minute that she'd allow a weapon in the house. No, it had to be her father's, which meant that Danny had also stolen it. They'd visited his farm the weekend before last. She was struck again by how empty the house seemed now that her mother was gone, and had sat in the kitchen with her father drinking cup after cup of black coffee, knowing how starved for conversation he was now. So that Danny was on his own most of the day. Through the big bay window she saw him go into the barn where her father kept his 2 remaining horses. A little later noticed him walking through the field of long dry grass toward the woods and stream beyond. And then she'd forgotten all about him until what must have been over an hour had passed, and he came slamming in through the screen door with a big box turtle in his hand. Danny all excited until she told him to put it back by the stream where he'd found it, that they weren't taking a turtle all the way back to Connecticut with them, and that was that. Her father kept his newer guns behind glass on a rack in the living room. The older ones, the ones he never used anymore, were stacked in the workshop of the cellar. She examined the stock. It was scratched and pitted. Her sinuses were giving her hell this summer, and she could barely smell a thing, but she sniffed it anyway. It smelled of earth and mold. It was her father's, all right. She sniffed again, the scent of old gun oil on her hands. Probably he hadn't used it in years. It would be months before her father noticed it was missing, if then. She threw the bolt. Inside, a brass shell casing gleamed. She felt a sudden mix of shock and fury. My God. He'd loaded the goddamn thing. Her father would never have left it loaded. That meant that Danny had searched around the basement for shells as well, and found some. How many more did he have? Where were they? She resisted the urge to go tearing through his drawers, rummaging through his closet. That could wait. What she needed to do now was find him and confront him. One more confrontation, more and more as he got older. She wondered how he'd explain this away. It was not going to be like stealing Milky Ways from the Pathmark store. It was not going to be like the fire he and Billy Barrett had set, yet denied they'd set, in the field behind the Catholic Church last year. He couldn't say that he'd meant to pay for the candy bars, but didn't because he got to looking at the comic books and forgot they were in his pocket. He couldn't claim that the two eyewitnesses, kids from the rougher part of town who'd seen Billy and Danny go into the field and then come out running and laughing just before smoke appeared on the horizon, had it in for him. The rifle was concrete, the bullet even more so. They did not lend themselves to easy explanation. It was not going to be like the jackknife from nowhere, or the brand new Sega Genesis computer game from nowhere, or the Bic cigarette lighters that kept cropping up, which he'd always found on the street. What a lucky kid. She was angry. She was scared. Angry and scared enough so that her hands were shaking, and she removed the shell from the breech and put it in her jeans pocket. She felt a by now all too familiar access of what could only be called grief, a feeling that even though her son was only 10, she'd already lost him somehow, as though there were something in him she could no longer touch or speak to, and for which mourning was easily as justifiable and as appropriate as her father's grief over the loss of her mother. She knew it was important to push that feeling aside, to let the anger flow freely instead. She needed the anger. Otherwise, too much love and loss, too much sympathy, and, let's face it, too much plain old-fashioned self-pity would only weaken her. Tough love, she thought, that's what's left. She tried the shrinks, tried the counselors, she tried to understand him. Taking things away from him, privileges, the computer, TV, the movies, was the only thing that seemed to work anymore. Well, they're all going out the window today. Everything. She slid the black bolt of the rifle back into position and marched on out of the room. She knew where to find him, at the clubhouse. The grass in her backyard tickled her ankles. It was time to cut the lawn again. Humidity made the stock of the rifle feel sticky in her hand. She slid between the two pine trees in the back of the lawn out onto the well-worn path into the woods. The path belonged to the boys. Billy Barrett, Danny, Charlie Haas, and the others. She never came back this way, hardly ever. Only when she was calling him for supper and he was late and didn't answer. Even then she rarely had to venture this far. The path was only 2 feet wide at most, through thick, waist-high brush, dry brown grass, and briars as tall as she was. A path the width of a boy's body, not the width of hers. She was glad of the jeans, already studded with burrs, and unhappy with the short-sleeved blouse. A thorn bush scored 2 lines of blood along her upper arm. She used the barrel of the rifle to part another. She heard the stream rushing over its rocky bed through a line of trees to her left. The path split ahead of her. She took it to the right, away from the stream. All these woods would one day be developed, bulldozed into oblivion. But in the 3 years they'd lived there, that hadn't happened yet, and Danny was getting to the age where soon it wouldn't matter. In the meantime, the woods and stream were part of the reason she'd wanted the place for him. Nature, she believed, was a teacher. She'd grown up on a farm and thought that most of what she knew about life she'd glimpsed there first, and then had to come to understand more fully later. Birth, death, sex, the renewal of the land, its fragility and its power, the chaos inside the order, the changes in people that came with the changes of seasons. The implacability of the natural world and how important it was simply to accept that. She wanted all this for Danny, what she'd had, and what now sustained her. She knew that many women would have been bitter about a broken marriage that they hadn't chosen to end, but she wasn't, not really. Unhappy, yes, of course, but there had never really been any bitterness. Love, she thought, was a contract you signed knowing that someday the signatures might fade. Richard had fallen out of love with her and gotten involved with someone else. A simple change of seasons. Hard as winter, but bearable and somehow even understandable. It was no longer necessary to the scheme of things that people mate for life. Reality was what it was and couldn't be changed by her own distress in the face of it. She thought Richard's choice of second partners was one he someday might live to regret, but that was his affair. She'd let him go. And she might have been bitter about Danny, too. Instead, she simply kept plugging away. Though the boy was far from easy. He'd never been easy. But since the breakup 4 years ago, he always seemed, if not actually in trouble, always on the verge of it. Sliding grades, clowning, fighting in class, bad language around the girls at school. Once he'd been caught throwing stones at Charlie Haas on the playground. And of course there were the stealing and brushfire incidents. Beyond paying child support, his father was no help at all. Richard thought it was all typical boy behavior. It would pass, he said. She'd never been a boy, and it was possible he was right. But Richard didn't have to live with it. Didn't have to endure the tantrums when he didn't get his way, or the hostile silences. She felt exhausted by him sometimes. What more could a kid get into? He thought get into firearms, obviously. At age 10. Great. Just great. She wondered how he'd smuggled it home in the first place, and then remembered the blanket she kept in the back of the station wagon. He could have hidden a box of dynamite back there, and she'd never have known it. Very cute, Danny. Very sneaky. Very neat. Her arms felt sticky with sweat, itchy from the pollen and dust in the air and the warm brush of leaves. She could barely breathe for all the damn pollen, but she was nearly there now. She could see its location in the distance to the right of the path, up a hill through a tall, thin stand of birch. His clubhouse, his personal sanctuary. Aside from the occasional visit from Billy Barrett, inviolate to the world. Until today. Once, perhaps 100 years ago, there had been a house here, but it had long since burned to the ground, leaving only the root cellar. Whoever the owners were, they'd never rebuilt it. He'd taken her up to look at it, all excited, shortly after they moved in and he first discovered it. At that time it was nothing but a hole in the ground 5 feet by 8 feet wide and 4 feet deep, overgrown with weeds. But he'd cleared the weeds to expose the fieldstone walls and raw earth floor within, and with her permission, begged a pair of old double doors from her father's barn. And he and Richard had spent one uncommonly ambitious afternoon painting the 2 doors green and sinking hinges into the walls and then attaching the doors so that they covered the hole and could be secured together by a combination padlock from the outside and a simple hook and eye from the inside. Total privacy. He called it his clubhouse, his private little gathering of one. She had always thought it was kind of sad, possibly not even good for him. But Danny had always been a loner. She guessed that was his nature. He always seemed to tolerate the other neighborhood boys more than he actually befriended them, though for some reason they all seemed to like him well enough and were eager to get him out to play, even though they were excluded from the clubhouse and were probably jealous that Danny discovered it first. For some reason that didn't seem to matter. Maybe the place imparted status of some kind. She didn't know. Boys, she thought. All she knew was that he spent a lot of time here, more than she'd have liked. She brought him a battery-powered lantern. Not much light got in through the doors, he said. A stepladder for going up and down. Toys and books and games would disappear and then reappear in his room, as well as mason jars from the kitchen and hammers and boxes of nails from the toolbox, so she knew he was bringing them out here and then returning them according to some private agenda. She never pried. But now she was going to have to take all this away from him, too, for a while. She leaned on the rifle, catching her breath before starting in on the remaining trek up the slope of the hill. She heard bees buzzing in the grass beside her. Her sinuses were killing her. Warm wind ruffled her hair. She steeled herself for what was to come and headed on. The doors had weathered considerably since last she'd seen them. They could seriously use another paint job. She saw that the combination lock was gone. That meant he had it with him. He was inside. Danny. No answer. She listened. No movement either. Danny, I know you're in there. She reached down for the door handles and rattled the doors. Come out of here, now. She was startled to get seriously angry again. Good, she thought. You damn well should be angry. I said now. You hear me? You're not supposed to be here. What? I said you're not supposed to be here. You never come out here. Well, that's too bad because I'm here now. Do I have to kick these doors apart or what? She heard a click and the rattle of glass and then steps on the ladder. She heard him unfasten the hook and the door creak open. He slid through the doors, out of the dark below, and let the doors fall shut behind him. There was something furtive about him, something she didn't like. He knelt and took the padlock out of his pocket. Leave it, she said. Stand up. Look at me. He did as he was told, and saw the rifle. Glanced at it once and then turned away. Where did you get this? He didn't answer. He just kept staring down the hill, arms folded across his skinny chest. It's your grandpa's, isn't it? No answer to that one either. You stole it, didn't you? I was going to put it back, he said, sullen, caught. Next time we went there. Oh, really? Were you going to put this back too? She took the bullet from her pocket and held it out to him. Or were you planning to use it? He sighed, staring down the hill. You have more of these? He nodded. Where? My drawer. You're in big trouble. You know that, don't you? He sighed again and then bent down with the padlock in his hand to secure the double doors. She remembered the way he'd opened them, just wide enough to slide through and no further. Leave it, she said. What's down there? Just my stuff. What stuff? You have some surprises for me? No. Open it up. I want to see. Mom, it's my stuff. As of today, you don't have any stuff. Not until I say you do. Do you understand me? Now open it. Mom! Open it. He stood there. He isn't going to move, she thought. Why, you little son of a... God damn it! She reached down and threw open one door and then the other, and the first thing that hit her was the smell, even with her sinus problem. The smell was rank and old and horrible beyond belief, and the second thing was the incredible clutter of rags and jars and buckets on the floor, and the third was what she saw on the walls, hanging there from masonry nails pounded into the fieldstone, hung like decorations, like trophies, like the galleries she'd seen in castles in Scotland and England on her honeymoon, in which were hunters' galleries. A boy's awful parody of that. His stuff. She gagged and put her hand to her mouth and dropped the bullet. She stooped reflexively to pick it up again. She looked at him, hoping that her knees wouldn't buckle, hoping crazily in a way that he wouldn't even be there. He was staring directly at her, the first time since he had climbed out of the root cellar. The expression on his face was neutral, but the look in his eyes was not. The eyes were examining her coldly, intent on her reaction, as perhaps they had examined coldly what was down below. Adult eyes, but not the eyes of any adult she'd ever seen, or ever dreamt to see. Was this her son? For a moment she felt a stunning terror of him, of this little boy who didn't even weigh 90 pounds yet, who still balked at showering every day and washing his hair on schedule. It was a terror that skittered suddenly inside her, and seemed to awaken all her memories of him at once, memories like claps of thunder, the stealing, the stone-throwing, the fire, the dark half-hidden glances, the bullying tantrums, terror that suddenly gave pattern to all of this. All the interstices of understanding and seeing suddenly closing together for her to compose a black seamless wall of events and behavior which defined him. And she knew. She looked into his eyes and saw what he was, and knew what he would become. She reeled under the weight of it. 10 years of life. When had it begun? At the breast? In the womb? She needed to know the whole of it, needed to embrace the horror of this as she had always needed his embrace, however cold, however distant. She had always needed to embrace her son. You have a light down there? she murmured. He nodded. Her voice faltered. Then, "Go turn it on," she said. He preceded her down the ladder and switched on the lantern. The room was suddenly very bright. She stood in his chamber and looked at the walls. The box turtle. Had he smuggled it here from her father's house too, or was this a different one, and how many others? What about before he found the clubhouse? What about... The turtle was nailed to the wall by its feet. Its shriveled head lolled back onto its graying shell. The frogs were impaled by a single nail through roughly the center of their bodies, and there were 6 of them. Some belly up, some not. She saw a pair of withered garter snakes, 3 crayfish, and a salamander. Like the turtle, the cats were nailed through all 4s. He had eviscerated both of them and looped their entrails around them, and nailed the entrails to the wall at intervals, so that the cats were at the center of a kind of crude bullseye. She saw that he had strangled them with some sort of rope or twine. He had nearly taken off the head of the larger one in doing so. Its black and white fur was caked with old dried blood. The other was just a kitten, a tabby. She was aware of him watching her. She was aware, too, of the tears in her eyes, and knew what he didn't know, that the tears were for her, not him, not this time. She wiped them away. She had heard of people like this, read about them, saw them on the evening news. It seemed they were everywhere these days. She knew what they were, and what they were not. She had not expected her son to be one of them. Her son was only 10. She saw all the years of his life ahead of him. So many years. So much death to come. Treatment, she thought. He needs treatment. He needs help. But they did not respond to treatment. "I'm going back up," she murmured. Her voice sounded flat and strange to her, and she wondered if it did to him, and then wondered if it was the fieldstone walls and earthen floor that made her voice sound the way it did, or if it was something inside her, some sea change in her that was expressing itself now in this new strange voice. She thought implacable. She moved up the stepladder and stepped out into the field and heard him snap off the lantern below as she threw the bolt on the rifle and inserted the bullet into the chamber. He looked up at her just once as he was near the top, and she saw that no, there was nothing to save in this nature, and she fired into his left eye, and he fell back into the root cellar. She closed the double doors. She would have to return the rifle to her father's. She would have to distract him somehow and put it back in his workshop where it belonged. And then she would call whoever, another missing boy. Sooner or later they'd find him, a combination padlock in his pocket, and they'd wonder, who would do such a thing? Such things. Those things on the walls. My God. How had it happened? It was a question she would ask herself, she thought, for a great many seasons after. As spring plunged into sweltering summer, as fall turned to winter again, and the coldness of heart and mind set in for its long, terrible duration. Well, that was a cheery one, right? So that is the ways of Jack Ketchum. Writes very, very realistic stories. And for this next piece, well, this one is an actual true story, and, well, get ready. It's called The Dust of the Heavens, and has been published on its own and in other collections. Here we go. Kenneth is dying of AIDS. His ex-wife called me. He's in a Pennsylvania hospital, which Helene says he'll never leave because he's much too weak to walk, and there's no place to care for him at home, nor any money for hospice care. So they'll keep him in the hospital the 2 months or so it takes him to die. That's all they give him, 2 months. Which means, among other things, that he won't be coming after me anymore. I can call off the dogs. He arrived at the hospital via the cops. Kenneth is my age, 47. His son Colin goes to college in New Jersey. Helene and Colin had seen him over Christmas and noted that the antipsychotic pills seemed to be working. He was calm and relatively reasonable, though he did look physically ill, alarmingly so. They suggested he get himself a checkup right away, but suspected he'd ignored that advice. Apparently he did, knowing, I'm sure, just how much good a checkup was going to do him. Then in April, he must have gone off the pills, or else he was experimenting with his dosage again, because Colin started getting calls at the dormitory. Crazy calls, the kind Kenneth makes from time to time. And finally, he wouldn't speak to his father anymore. To his father, Colin just wasn't in. So Kenneth responded by telling whoever was fielding the calls for him that he'd better hear Colin on the line right now, or he was coming over there armed and dangerous, and there was going to be a whole lot of blood on the floor by the time he left. When he hung up, they phoned the New Jersey police, who in turn called the Pennsylvania police, who arrested him for making terrorist threats to innocent college kids, and Kenneth was back in the hands of the system again. Not the first time. In fact, the last I'd heard he'd gone to jail was less than a year ago. He'd walked into a police station to accuse Helene of child abuse. Walked in with a paper bag over his head to protect his anonymity because he knew that there was a warrant out for his arrest on charges of threatening his mother's life. Kenneth, the unknown plaintiff. It took the cops a few hours to convince him to remove the bag. Eventually he did. Anyhow, by the time the blood on the floor incident rolled around, the police in Pennsylvania already knew him better than they'd ever wanted to. Still, they did the decent thing. Instead of taking him to the slammer, they brought him to a state psychiatric facility and checked him in. Kenneth is a paranoid schizophrenic. Has been for many years now. A fine, brilliant soul living in a jungle maze of misfired synapses and biochemical warfare which sooner or later might well have found him lost and dead anyhow, had not the AIDS come along. He is also my oldest friend. We go all the way back to junior high together, to 1958, I think, though we may have met even earlier. Oddly enough, Kenneth would be the one to know this. I bet he could pin the year down cold. My own grip on dates, time, and events has always been shaky at best and grows worse as I get older. But Kenneth collects events, real or imagined, or a mix of both. The way a squirrel connects nuts for the winter. The way the old joke goes, a woman stores her grievances. Dates and times always seem to center him, to pin him down to reality, even then. Great art, he wrote me once, is the dust of the heavens. Sad thought, but beautiful too. This in the midst of a long rambling letter that detailed how the state of New Jersey was out to destroy him. But it was art and the love of art that drew us together. His for painting, mine for books. We couldn't help it. We were both precocious as hell, nor could we help the fact that caring about either of these two things was bound to set us apart from everybody else we knew, from every other kid we hung around with. Nobody else was going to get passionate about Shakespeare or D.H. Lawrence or Michelangelo or Paul Klee. Nobody else was going to sit up all night during a sleepover leafing through art books and reading Ray Bradbury aloud. Not a soul. We were stuck with each other. Fine. I was amazed to even have found a kindred spirit in our little suburban New Jersey town. Certainly not somebody so enthusiastic and so generous, so much into sharing his enthusiasms. Without even quite knowing it, we set out to educate each other, especially the kinds of stuff you weren't going to find in school. We were teenagers, after all, in the grip of our gonads, in a repressive place and time. So I turned him on to Lady Chatterley's Lover and Henry Miller's Tropics and Justine by de Sade. He introduced me to the German Expressionists, their grim perversity, to romantic pre-Raphaelite nudes sexy as anything in Playboy, and to Lautrec's dancers, drunkards, and whores. He started writing some, I tried painting. We'd go down into my damp, dark basement, and Kenneth would set up a canvas for me and hand me the paints, and I'd do awful, ridiculous imitations of Jackson Pollock. I couldn't even get the drip right, never mind the smear. While we worked in oils and produced these amazing abstract studies on the other side of the room, in the same time it took me to realize that I'd failed again. Shapes like catacombs filled with light, like Nemo's Nautilus gliding through a cavernous sea. He was much more advanced in his craft than I was at mine. It didn't bother me. Though later on it bothered him. In time it came to bother him a lot. And I think it was then that I began to fear him slightly, that I began to draw away. We got into photography. With his savings from work after school, he bought some second-hand equipment and set up a darkroom in his basement. I photographed girlfriends, or would-be girlfriends, He photographed forests, brooks, trees. Human subjects didn't much interest him. We spent practically every Saturday in his basement for a while, developing, fudging, cropping, and printing, awash in the smell of chemicals and silent under the dim red lights. It was just about the only time I ever saw his house, and even that was fleeting. Barely a moment to gaze at his mother's Japanese prints on the wall, or pass his father's World War II model airplanes, wave a quick hello to whichever one of them was at home at the time. They never seemed to be together there, and then hit the stairs. I remember Kenneth in dim lights, the red light from the basement, the night light by my bedside. Sleepovers were big then, all through high school. Kenneth slept at my house many times. I at his house, never. The reason was, ostensibly, that his mother didn't like having company around when she got up in the morning. That didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but then I hardly knew his mother. She was just a college teacher like his father who smiled at me whenever I showed up at his house and who collected Japanese art. She had a nice smile. It was hard to believe she was the awful bitch that Kevin said she was. That she'd lock him out of the house at night if he was 5 minutes late. That she was prone to frequent rages, trying to slap hell out of him over some imagined affront. That she went through his drawers and stole his money. She was just this little dumpy Italian lady with a pretty smile. That's all I saw. Certainly my mother didn't believe him. We'd talk after he left. How could a mother be that way, she'd ask me. A mother! She figured he had to be exaggerating. It was impossible to blame her. It would be years before TV and media started showing us babies dropped out of windows or scalded to death or drowned and dumped in dumpsters. Was Kenneth an abused child? I don't think anybody will ever know for certain. Like my mother, I thought he was exaggerating at the time. Even then he was given to bouts of self-aggrandizing, mysteriousness, wild flights of fancy. It was part of his charm, part of his precocity. Now I'm not so sure. Knowing where he went and the hard road he took to get there, it seems likely to me that he was telling us the truth. But nobody really bought it then, not even me. But you had to see that something strange was going on. I've never seen a kid spend so much time at somebody else's house, as Kenneth spent at mine. Not before or since. Overnights, after school, weekends. Many nights he ate dinner with us before the two of us started our 6 to 10 shift at my father's soda fountain candy store. My dad was not fond of Kenneth or of having him at his table. He'd hired him only at Mom's insistence. Art, in my dad's book, was not a man's game. But then, neither was literature. He had no say in it, though, because by then Kenneth and my mother had sort of adopted each other. Once again, I had no problem with that. I was an only child. I liked the company. But these two were truly diligent in their relationship and serious about maintaining it. There were nights I'd fall asleep on the couch while the two of them sat up and talked far into the night. It was my mother, not Kenneth's, who received cards and gifts for Mother's Day, whose birthday he remembered. He spent every Christmas with us for 8 years. Even my dad got a present. It was hard, eventually, to tell my mother that the Kenneth she knew wasn't the same anymore, wasn't sane anymore, that he scared me. Helene thinks, and I agree, that the worst of it began with his marriage, and then took a quantum leap after Colin was born. Before that, through college at Rhode Island School of Design and work at design firms like Germain Monteil, he'd shown constant promise, if a tendency toward high egoism and defensiveness that often found him butting heads with the bosses. But his work was getting noticed. He had paintings at the O.K. Harris Gallery in Manhattan, sharing space with Warhol and Jasper Johns. Art mavens Ivan Karp and Leo Castelli were admirers. Through all those years we kept in close touch. I remember a lot of firsts with Kenneth. The first time I ventured into Newark after dark was with him, to see Mamie Van Doren's live at the Art Theater, after a nude appearance in Playboy. My first trip to Manhattan without my father was also with him, to a party hosted by Andy Warhol, during which I thought I'd died and gone to heaven, that I'd somehow managed to pick up the most beautiful woman in the room until she turned around to get a drink at the bar and the dark tufts of hair down her backbone told me I'd picked up the most beautiful guy in the room instead. The first time I smoked pot was in his dorm room at RISD. I had my first cognac there, too, unfortunately the same night. And he was the first to tell me and make me believe that it was possible that I could someday write as well as the people I was reading, that in me lay the potential for at least a speck of artistry. As the 70s rolled around, I got involved with a woman and moved to Manhattan, and Kenneth married and settled across the river in New Jersey. Meetings were sporadic, and most often uncomfortable. It was like he wasn't talking to us anymore. He was putting on a show instead. His Kenneth the Genius show. It was important to pore over the paintings, admire them, and to talk about them in great detail, to talk endlessly about his plans for future works, their technology, subject matter, where and when he was going to show them, when the time was exactly right. It was important to allow him to rant bitterly at his cheapskate bitch witch of a mother. It was important to listen to him blast away at all those critics and dealers who weren't exactly pounding the doors down to get his stuff. Helene didn't help. I think she was in awe of him at first. For a woman with little artistic talent of her own to speak of, and only a moderate education, Kenneth was a pretty heady brew. I'd seen him bowl over people far more sophisticated. You couldn't blame her. One day he announced to me that she was pregnant. There was going to be no abortion. Kenneth was going to be a father. I tried like hell to talk him out of it. So did my girlfriend. We stressed the practical reasons, like he wasn't making a whole lot of money, and why did he want the burden of a kid just then? But I think we were both well aware that Kenneth's ego was already beginning to run amok, that his ego could swamp a kid. Which I guess it almost did. The last time I saw him, he arrived unannounced at my apartment in the middle of the day. I'd been working. I was surprised, to put it mildly. He'd obviously been put off with me for about a year now. The reason was mostly that both Paula and I refused to take him terribly seriously when he talked about the elaborate murder conspiracy he was documenting, which had, he said, already taken the life of a New Jersey doctor and a teenager, Kenneth's second cousin, a faked suicide in a police station holding cell, and which involved high-level mafioso types with political ties to both his mother and other members of his mother's side of the family. Nor would we take seriously that he had recently acquired a direct psychic mainline to both Mother Teresa and the Dalai Lama. Nor his assertions that Helene was abusing Colin and that his mother was engaged in slowly poisoning his father to death. And certainly not his notion of avoiding child support payments to the by-now hated bitch Helene by faking a new social security number and tax returns and then fleeing to a concrete bunker of his own design and execution somewhere deep in the Pennsylvania hills, surrounded by wild bears which he would train with jars of honey and coyotes he would tame to guard them against all trespassers, mafia, police, or FBI, all of whom were supposedly on his case by now. Paula and I were buying into none of it. There was too much dope in his life for one thing, and too many pills. My own individual offenses were worse. I had suggested that now as a couple of times before, a hospital was where he belonged, that he was doing himself no good this way, that he needed help, which made me part of the problem. The problem was that no one would believe what he knew to be true. The mafia, the murders, Mother Teresa, the whole damn ball of yarn. He'd resented me for quite a while. His own career had faltered, while I had just published my third novel, and if I wasn't getting rich out here in writing land, I was at least holding my own, making a living, doing what I'd always wanted to do, what so many years ago we talked about doing. It looked like the pupil had somehow slipped by the master, to him at least. He made it known to me that beyond my first book he had never read me and didn't intend to, that I had sold out in his judgment. I had written a popular novel. And while he could admire its craft, well, craft was part of the problem too. There wasn't any room for an artist these days. Just guys like me. Cop-outs, sellouts, panderers. Adding insult to injury, I'd managed a long-term relationship with a woman while Kenneth's own marriage had ended bitterly, explosively. Since then he'd been screwing a guy here, a lady there. Nothing that held. Nothing that worked. It didn't help the situation that my particular woman had no patience with him, with his monologues, his wild, complicated stories, and his artist posturings. She challenged him at every turn. I tried to mediate. It never worked. Not for a minute. I think he began to hate her long before he started hating me. I think it galled him that I hung on to such a bitch, yet another bitch. So I was surprised to see him at my apartment that day. We sat down at the table over coffee. He was thinner, too thin, I thought, nervous, and seemed to have trouble getting the words out, as though his lips or teeth were bothering him. Coke, I thought. Drugs again. He wasn't staying long, he told me. He'd only come to warn me about something. His own phone was tapped, and he suspected that as a friend of his, so was mine. Otherwise he'd have phoned me. He had proof, finally, that his mother was a witch. He wasn't talking metaphor. According to Kenneth, his mother had revealed herself to him as the genuine article, a bona fide minion of Satan. He'd gone to New Jersey to confront her with the knowledge that she'd been systematically poisoning his father and demanded to see him. His father was too ill to be disturbed, she said. He was dying of bone cancer. They argued. Kenneth insisted. She flew into a rage. And, he said, he watched, stunned, as her head did a 360-degree turn on her shoulders, a la Linda Blair, a la The Exorcist. It might have been funny. It wasn't. In fact, no horror movie has ever chilled me so completely. It was the solemnity, the openness even to ridicule this time, the absolute conviction that he had seen what he had seen that was so scary. However impossible, however crazy this was, for the first time I saw that not only did he believe what he was telling me, just as he believed the conspiracies and the open line to Mother Teresa, but that somehow he had actually seen this thing, observed it. It wasn't imagined reality, it was reality. And this time I didn't deny him. I listened carefully, respectfully. I asked questions. I poured him a second cup of coffee. I wasn't humoring him. Whatever this construct he'd made for himself was, you simply had to respect it. That's how big it was. It had power, pure and simple. A power that to him was undeniable and irresistible. There was a sort of truth here, I realized. There was also genuine terror. The end result for me was humility. I listened. And it became clear that for some reason he needed to get this story out specifically to me. I didn't know why. We just sat and talked about the impossible. At the end of it, he actually seemed satisfied, relaxed, the two of us oddly more at peace with one another than we'd been in a very long time. A few moments passed in silence, I remember. Then I could see him tense again, and I finally understood why it was me he had to say this to. His mother, he told me, was capable of doing anything now. She was going to try to hurt him bad. He knew that, and he was preparing for it. I shouldn't worry, not about him. But he was seriously afraid she might try to get to him through his friends, especially through me. He said he felt I was in danger. So he was not going to see me again, not for a very long time. He was changing his phone number and he wasn't going to give me the new one. If she didn't think we were in touch anymore, then maybe she'd leave me alone. It was worth trying. Other than that, he was afraid he couldn't protect me. He was worried. He'd write once in a while, if that was okay. I said it was. There were tears in his eyes. Kenneth never cried. I reached out and took his hand. It was only much later, after a late-night phone call, that I realized where those tears were coming from and why, and what he was really saying to me. I walked him out of the apartment. I said I had some errand or other, but what I really needed was a drink. That and to get him out of there. He'd shaken me. The day was bright and sunny, summer in the city. I remember that we didn't have much to say. Then, just as we reached the subway station, a rock came out of nowhere and landed right in front of me, not 2 steps away. It hit hard, and I watched it bounce about 15 feet into the air. It easily could have killed me. My nerves didn't need this, not today. I looked up to see if there was some kind of construction going on in the high-rise above us, but couldn't see any. In my mood, I was basically looking for someone to sue, I think. I looked at Kenneth. He was smiling. "Watch your step," he said. "See?" For the second time that day, I felt a chill along my spine, because at that moment I shared his fear completely. I embraced it, and it was mine. I felt her hand reach out to me, and it was a cold hand and unyielding. For that single split second, he made me a believer, that it was possible, that anything was possible. I could almost grasp, almost feel exactly how small a step it was from my reality to his, and his was terrifying. Then it was gone. I was back in my world again, safe. From Pennsylvania, he wrote, eventually the manipulation of the environment around me began. I got images on my TV set that were pure nightmares. The stores I bought from had things on the shelves that were impossible to sell because of legality and utter rarity. I was surrounded by impersonators who would repeat my private telephone conversations loud enough for me to overhear. The effort to drive me crazy was so expensive I understood it could break the county budget. The local residents who have witnessed this spectacle have gone into revolt, scared by this high-tech invasion of rural nowhere. By the time I got the phone call, the Kenneth I knew was gone, sunk beneath the weight of 1,000 fears and fancies. What was left was paranoia and rage. Rage against Catholics, Jews, governments, friends and family, employers, galleries, the entire world, which could not see what he could see. I was not exempt. He called late one night and started shouting that I had betrayed him, that Paula had betrayed him, and that anybody who betrayed him, everybody, was going to pay. They were going to pay with blood and pain because he wasn't going to take this lying down anymore. He was done forgiving, done forever. His voice was thick with meanness. He scared the hell out of me. The following day I bought an answering machine. I left it on all day and all night. I described him to the doormen in my building and gave him his name and told them we were never at home to this person. Never. Not under any circumstances whatsoever. On the machine he left a single message, a loud "fuck you," full of fury. The hang-up calls, the long empty silences went on and on. I realize now that he'd warned me about this, that this day might come. He told me it was his mother I had to worry about, but it wasn't. It was him. And then, because he couldn't help it, he'd cried. When a friend of yours disappears into madness, there's not really any time, any moment to mourn his passing. These things happen gradually. They creep up on you like a goddamn thief. You know that your friend is somewhere out there in the world. He's still alive. He's not himself, but he's there, and maybe he haunts you the way Kenneth haunted me, frustrating you, pissing you off, frightening you. There's anger and a sense of waste, but no love, not really. You can't love insanity, and that's what he is right now. That's who he is. It defines him. The man, the boy I was such good friends with, has been gone from me for a very long time. In and out of a wrong-headed marriage and a botched career, in and out of mental hospitals, in and out of jails. I stopped answering his long, rambling, often accusatory but meticulously handwritten letters 3 years ago. Just a few months ago he finally stopped writing. But I guess that because I knew he was still alive somewhere in Pennsylvania, because I was scared of him and frustrated by what he'd become, and because I didn't want to see him, and maybe because I'd known him for so long in so many incarnations it was damn near impossible to imagine a world without Kenneth in it. I'd never mourned him. I'm mourning now. I feel sorry for you, Kenneth wrote bitterly in his last letter to me, because you do not have one good story to tell. He was taking me to task for selling out again. Kenneth, I hope this at least proves you wrong. I wish you could read it, the old you, not the later you, and certainly not the dying. Goodbye, old friend. I miss you. And that was where the story ended. But in a later edition of the story, Mr. Ketchum included an afterword, which continues the tale a bit. So here we go. In one way at least, Kenneth beat the rap. Shortly after Brutarian published this piece, I learned that some brand new chemical cocktail had drummed his disease into full retreat. So he was not going to die after all, at least not imminently. And it occurred to me that he might have been amused to know that his departure had already been announced. But as of this writing, I don't believe he does. I sure didn't tell him. I have, I think, good reasons why. In May of this year, 3 months ago, I received my first letter from Kenneth in a very long time. It was addressed to me, to both my real name and Jack Kersey, incorrectly, to the woman I live with, to her sister, and to a mutual friend from our college years who lives a few blocks away. These sisters' and friends' names were also misspelled, though Kenneth knew both of them quite well. From the letter I learned that he now held stock in Citibank, Bell Atlantic, and AT&T, and that he was living with a woman. She is beautiful, he said. She is exquisite. She is not blunt and coarse. The woman would inherit all his earthly goods eventually, not his son. The parlor game of Colin and Helene is finished, he said. He went on to tell me that he'd received his transcripts from our high school just that day. In my senior year, he said, all my grades were censored. The blackmail from you, Kevin, Jack, and Mary Ann explodes in my official transcript. I am censored at 17. Pennsylvania did its very best to do me in. However, Pennsylvania ran into American Express, Christie's, MoMA, Nabisco, the Newark Museum, the Missionaries of Charity, Calcutta, Bronx, Newark, the Reformed Buddhist Church of Tibet, Suru Gallery, Japan Gallery, Ronin Gallery. I have no idea what kind of blackmail he might have been thinking of, and my guess is that the other 3 people he mentions, all high school classmates, wouldn't either. The letter ends with one-line references to his garden, his house being warm and dry, his plans to go back to school and then teach, spring weather, and various other bits of business. But he's not quite done with me yet. Your paperback books are so tired. All the cliches of the macho flake. Ouch. I have to get a white pine now. Too hip, gotta go. Then in June another letter. Stranger still, especially as it refers to me. It seems to me that your little world rests on Colin. You have no son to work over. You have the shallow side of life. Sit and type and then go to a bar. Computers. I have bears, deer, cars to drive, and I know every policeman in the USA. Your answering machine plays police sirens, but I have police touch me to feel the flesh. You and Colin are connected, but you have no son. My looks are coming back. My name is scrawled across the page along with that of William Jefferson Clinton, yet another old high school friend, and Elvis Costello. I don't think I've had a real talk with Colin in my life. On the second page of the letter, there's a typed communication from one John R. Thomas, Supervisory Special Agent for the Philadelphia Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It's dated June 1st, on FBI letterhead shrunk down to fit the upper right-hand corner of the page. It says in part, in reference to your telephone call and subsequent mail, this matter is not handled by the FBI. It is handled by your local telephone company. Contact them and have a block placed on your telephone so that your long-distance carrier cannot be changed without your written consent. No federal violation that is under jurisdiction of the FBI has occurred. There's no direct explanation as to what this is about. Instead, he goes on to tell me to fly to Greece at your age and prance about. I drive for 10.5 years now. My auto is famous. Colin is a nobody. You are a nobody now, too. He quotes a few lines from the Bristol Stomp and then says, you were a high school English teacher in Boston. I went to Yale. I went to jail. Of all the party boys, I am the only international one of the lot. You, Helene, Colin, Mom, Debbie, Paula, Neil are all buying and selling on my story. I know who I am seeing in the Allentown office of the FBI. I know who is shadowing me in New Jersey. The cage door is open now. You were like a house cat. Now cats in PA are being dropped on the streets I drive. Writing this now, I slipped the letter back into its envelope and noticed something I'd missed when I received it. Inside the envelope is a 2-inch square of paper. I guess I just overlooked it. But as I discover it now, I see that it's my own writing, my own hand. My last name and address snipped off the envelope of some letter I'd sent him God knows when. I turn over the square of paper and it says, Fake Dallas writing. You write in script, honey. I don't. I'm a lefty and script is painful for me. Once Kenneth would have known that, but even my handwriting's suspect now. The answering machine stays on 24 hours a day, because Kenneth's right about one thing. You can hear a police siren in the background underneath the message on my machine. If you live in New York long enough, you get so you barely even notice sirens of any sort, no matter how long and loudly they wail away. And the day I retaped it, some cop was racing full tilt to somewhere or other up Amsterdam Avenue. The letter arrived in June. That means he's called me lately, or tried to. Friends, especially out-of-towners, usually get a kick out of the siren. It reminds them that they're calling the city. I think I'll let it stay. August 1998. And that, friends, is the genius of Jack Ketchum, a wonderful man who is dearly missed. Thanks to all for listening. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll talk again soon.